Awesome. Welcome and thank you for joining us on this Tuesday morning for understanding DSM-5 TR changes addressing substance use disorders for the helping professional with our presenter, Jennifer Haywood. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Great Lakes ATTC and SAMHSA. The Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC are funded by SAMHSA under the following cooperative agreements. The views expressed in this webinar are the views of the speaker and do not reflect the official position of DHHS and SAMHSA. The ATTC network uses affirming language to promote the promises of recovery by advancing evidence-based and culturally informed practices. We do have a few housekeeping items for you. If you are having any technical issues, please individually message me, Alyssa Kuala, or Jen Winslow in the chat section, and we would be happy to assist you. If you do have any questions for the speaker, we will be utilizing the chat today. So please put any questions that you have in the chat, and Jennifer will be taking care of those questions for you. And at the end of this webinar, you will be redirected to a very short survey, and it would be greatly appreciated if you took the 2 to 3 minutes to fill that out. Certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to all who attended the session in full. And if you would like to stay connected with the Great Lakes ATTC, follow us on our social media. We have Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our podcast channel. And I am super honored and excited to hand this over to our presenter, Jennifer Haywood. Thank you so much for being here, Jennifer.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Go ahead if you want to and put in the chat where you're from and what your role is at work. I'm just going to give a little introduction about myself and just a tiny disclaimer. There are hundreds of you on here. So when I do this webinar format, which I've done just a couple of times, because I really do like faces and I don't see your faces, I do like to kind of man the chat on my own. So feel free to put in the chat when I am teaching questions that you have. And my style will be to teach for a little bit and then peek at the chat and see what the questions are. I'll kind of go back and forth. If there are way too many questions, because there are so many of you, I'll kind of switch it to the Q&A box. But for now, you can kind of throw your questions in the chat while I talk. We've got people from everywhere. Feel free to peek at the chat yourselves to see where everyone's from. Oh my gosh, I'm not even going to read everybody. So as you guys are throwing up there where you're from, it's kind of fun for me to see. I'll just give you a little introduction about myself and then show you what I have in front of me as far as tools, and then we will get started. And I will share the screen as soon as I finish talking. I'm also being recorded today, so I'm very mindful that I'm being recorded, and there's a lot of you. So I'm going to keep my cuss words to a minimum, but please know that I am professional but casual, and I do kind of have a casual style. So to keep you all engaged and keep you all kind of interacting with me, hopefully that is okay with all of you. I am an addiction specialist from the Columbus, Ohio area. Right now, we are sitting in my office. This is where the magic happens with my clients. I also teach at Ohio State in the social work program. I'm in my 20th year, and the DSM class was the very first class I ever was asked to teach in 2003. So I am older than I look because I have really good hair dye. So just know that I've been around a really long time. As you all are introducing yourselves in the chat, if you want to, feel free to say what the very first DSM that you learned on was. My first DSM that I learned on in 1994 was the DSM-4. So that was the first DSM I ever learned on, was the 4. Oh, 1980, you beat me. You guys that learned on the 3, you beat me for sure. And so you all have seen many, many changes if you've learned on the 3. So today, I'm going to be highlighting the changes from the 5 to the 5 TR, but I may throw in some 4 TR to 5 changes because they were so drastic in the substance section that we may kind of review that just a tiny bit. So that's kind of how I will do that today. I also train groups, and just forgive me that the webinar is not my common format. Usually I see faces. So just kind of be patient with me doing this format and trying to get to all of you and project information and do that in 2 hours. For those of you on Central Time, thank you for being here at 8 a.m. very nice of you because 9 a.m. works the best for me. So that's where we're going to start today. So let me just show you what I have next to me. And as you all are kind of throwing up what you've learned, which DSM you learned in, where you're from, what you're doing, that's awesome. I'm going to show you what I have next to me. So this is, if you haven't bought one yet, this is what the very new DSM looks like. It's the 5 TR. I bought the tabs. They have not made tabs yet for the TR. So if you buy tabs, the tabs are for the 5, and you just have to wing it as far as page numbers go. So you don't worry about the page numbers, just look for the sections. So this is what it's shiny and pretty and very thick. And there's more narrative in this one, and I'll be telling you about all the changes soon. So this is what it looks like. They also have the tiny desk reference. This is not to learn on, I tell my students. This is just to look up the F codes. They have sufficiently moved from the ICD-9 and the 2-digit codes. Those are gone. We're doing ICD-10 and F codes only. So just know that all of your systems at work probably have been changed by now. Bridget just said, I found them on Amazon. Absolutely. You can get a whole package deal in Amazon. So you can absolutely buy those too. We're not doing case studies today, but I want to show you the case study book that I like. And when I do part 2 DSM trainings, this is the one I bought. So if you like case studies, it's Case Book for DSM-5 Diagnosis and Treatment Planning, Elizabeth Ventura. So I will write that in the chat if you're interested in that. If any of you are supervisors and you want to teach your folks how to practice, this is the best we have. There's no TR case studies yet. You'll have to do the adapting yourself. So what I teach you today should really help with the adapting. The tabs aren't needed. They just help my brain. So you never need tabs. They're just like my organizational kind of type A personality, maybe a tiny bit OCD brain likes the tabs. So that's why I suggest the tabs. So let me put in the chat before I get started with the lecture. I'm going to put in the chat so Elizabeth Ventura is the author of the case study book. I got it on Amazon, wasn't super expensive. That's the case study book if you like the case study book. I'm also going to put a website in the chat. So let me do that now. It's psychiatry.org. And when you go on psychiatry.org, you're going to look up the fact sheets that are going to highlight the changes that I'm going to tell you about today. And you can print these out yourself. This is what these look like, and I'm going to talk about them today. These are all the changes from the 5 to the 5 TR in a little nutshell. And if you want a bird's eye view of the changes, thank you, Alyssa. I do love when my people look up the exact link. That is super cool. So here they are. These are the fact sheets that I'm going to talk about today. But if you want to print out all the narrative for yourselves, these are all the changes in a nutshell from the 5 to the 5 TR. So you can do that also. We will find the links for you in a little bit. I'll have Alyssa kind of look up where these are, but I know that I looked at, it's the APA psychiatry.org fact sheet page. So we will find that for you guys. All right. And then this is the old DSM that we're kind of transitioning to. If you look at all of these sticky notes, these are what denote what I like to call the itty bitty changes that I am not going to highlight today unless we have time, but there's the fact sheets in the chat. I don't want you guys to worry about these itty bitty changes, but I will tell you about them later. And what's super interesting is you only need to think about these little itty bitty changes depending on the copyright of your 5. So I'll tell you about that in a second. These are not as important. These are like one-word switches, or some of these changes are in the narrative. It might say that this diagnosis is between age 7 and 12, and maybe they switched it to age 6. So they're really minute that may or may not affect you, but I'll talk about these just a little bit, but I don't want you to worry about these as much as the other changes that I'm going to talk to you about today that are highlighted in the fact sheets. So we got the fact sheet changes that I'm going to talk about. We've got these itty bitty changes I'll just let you know about. And then we are going to highlight, as this group asked me to do, the substance use disorder section and some of the changes there. So as you all know, if you are an addiction specialist, oh, it's Seattle, you're so early. It's so early for you, Kathy. I'm so happy you're here. I hope you have a giant coffee in front of you. So I'm going to share my screen and get going. So just know that the fact sheet changes. It's so funny. I'm like, I'm making my screen big with nobody on it because I'm just so sad that I have nobody on my screen. So I have the chat open so that you all can talk to me as I go. So just know that that website that Alyssa just put in the chat, that's where all my fact sheet changes are. The little itty bitty changes aren't as important, but I'll refer to them later. If you have your 5TR, you can follow along today. And then all of the substance use disorder changes, there are major changes that happened from the 4TR to the 5. So if you've been on an extended nap and you haven't opened the 5 from the 4TR, this 5TR is going to blow you away with the substance use disorders, because we went from abuse and dependence to substance use disorder, mild, moderate, severe, and we turned the whole section upside down. So I'm not going to go over that whole big thing that happened, because today is about the TR changes, but I'll refer to it and then I'll tell you the little tweaks. And you will all receive copies of the training on the website. I believe there's going to be an email, and I believe on the website you'll be able to get the slides. So that will all be available to you. And Molly, I totally remember the GAF score, and I remember teaching my students how to GAF, and it was like the bane of our existence. And when they lifted it, there was a part of me that like missed it. I missed it. I was like, that was really kind of helpful, that GAF score. But it was the bane of all of our existence trying to pick a GAF score. So yes, the 5 axes are gone. If you guys have been asleep 20 years, the 5 axes are gone. So just know that. All right, Alyssa threw in the chat how you're going to be able to get all this information when we get going. I am fueled by a very hyped up personality and caffeine, and I ran this morning. So if anybody wants to slow me down, I'm going to say, put that in the chat, please slow down and ask a little question. So here we are, everybody. Let's get started. Oh, good. Oh, Cornfield County, Illinois. Nice. I'm in the middle of Ohio. We had a little discussion before we started today on how New Yorkers think that all the Midwest has the same accents, but I would like to say that you Minnesota, Wisconsin people do not sound like me in Columbus. So I'm just going to throw that out there right now. Okay. If someone's in Nigeria, okay, that's wild and amazing. Okay, so let's, I just want to, so I started adding this to my DSM-5 TR changes training. So now I've done this training about 5 times. So I'm getting a lot better at it. So you guys get the benefit of being my most recent training. I want to go over something before we get started, that if any of you are supervisors out there and you are teaching people, I want to give you a tool that you can use. Oh, Christine said OHIO. I want to give you a tool that you can use. And if you're not from Ohio, that means nothing to all of you, that you can help when you supervise your folks. And I actually teach this to all my DSM classes, and it's called the decision tree. And so I'm going to throw something out there. Has nothing to do with the changes, but everybody loves this. And now I get emails all the time. Can you remind me of what that tree thing is? So I'm going to type it in the chat as I go so you can see the tree. But I suggest if you don't have a pen and paper out, throw some notes. But it's important, and I feel like it gets us started in a really good space to kind of teach a tool on who even gets into the diagnosis manual at all.
Hey,
And
Jennifer,
so,
you froze up a little bit.
oh,
You froze up when you were explaining a little bit, so I don't know if you want to back
okay,
to just a little.
okay. So I heard I froze, so I'm gonna explain the tree to all of you right now. And the tree is a tool that you can a client and we start to fit. Oh, shoot.
Jennifer, I stopped your
Yeah.
video since you kept freezing.
I need to take my video off, don't I?
Yep, I just turned it off for you.
Okay. So can you hear me? I won't know if I freeze now.
Yep, you're doing great. Hi, folks. It seems that Jennifer has frozen again. I see she just logged out and we'll be right back in just a second.
All right. Never mind. You guys don't get to learn anything from me today. Can you guys hear me again?
Yes, yep.
Okay. All right. We're going to do, I'm going to do my best here. All right. Let me share the screen again. Oh, goodness. I don't know what's going on today, you guys. Honestly, this has never happened to me before doing a training, and it's kind of freaking me out a little bit. All right. Yes, it's not just you guys up north that are freezing. It's all of us. So I'm going to do my best. I'm going to keep my face off. So much for my tree. I guess nobody really cares about my tree, right? So subjective distress. And then everybody needs functional impairment in order to be in the DSM. And then time and severity. So I always tell my students, you need to be having the symptoms long enough and you need to have enough symptoms. Then you want to rule out substance, and we're going to talk about substance induced today. You're going to rule out medical. You're going to rule out medical condition. This is my favorite one. I just added this to the treat lately. You're going to rule out trauma, because I feel like everything looks like trauma. The slide is, can you guys see the slides? Yeah, we're on decision tree and I'm writing in the chat. So look in the chat if you want to see what I'm talking about. Rule out trauma. So subjective distress, functional impairment, time and severity, rule out substance, rule out medical condition, rule out trauma.
Jennifer, if you're putting in the chat, make sure it's going to everyone, not the just the hoster.
Hold on. It's not up, you guys. It's not up yet. I have to push enter. So hang in there. I got you. I promise. Diagnosis. Okay. So here's the tree. So I put it in there and now I'm going to talk about it. So when you think about who belongs in this teal book, you want to think about everybody who's in your office needs to be experiencing at least some subjective distress that causes some type of functional impairment, time and severity, rule out substance, rule out medical condition, rule out trauma, and then look at the differential diagnosis section. So this is what the reason I throw this tree up in the beginning is I'm going to refer to it as I talk about the changes. And what I want you all to remember is most of us go in and out of the DSM, the trees in the chat. I'll make a tree on the slides next time. This is how I usually do it. I teach it out loud and put it in the chat so that it's more interactive. But when it's this big group, maybe next time I'll put it on the slides. So I apologize if you guys can't see what I'm doing right now. So when you think about somebody who goes in the book, I want you all to go back to the very first class you ever took with the DSM. And I want you to think about how we all read the narrative. And the narrative is where a lot of the changes are this time. So There's a lot of language and labeling changes from the 5 to the 5 TR. And the reason I start off with the tree is because so many of us aren't reading the narrative anymore. We're going in our quick guides and we're looking at the F codes and we're labeling the person with depression because we know that they're depressed and we move on. And so what's going to be different about this DSM is this DSM wants us to think a lot more about the language that is being used in the narrative. And I'm going to talk about that today. I want to give you a little bit of a spiel about, and it's on my slide now. Everything's on the slides now, everybody. I want to give you a little bit about what I was talking about with the tiny changes. So the tiny changes are this. If your DSM-5, your purple book, if your purple book was made, copyrighted after 2015, you already have all the minor changes in your old purple book. You don't even have to worry about those changes. All the texts made in 2013 and 2014 don't have these tiny little changes at all. And so if you know in your head that you are somebody that really wants to be aware of the very small little nuances in the narratives, I want you to look in your old DSM-5 and I want you to look at the copyright. And if the copyright is 2013 or 2014, then as you open your teal book, be much more mindful of the narrative. If your old book was made in 2015, you don't have to be as mindful because you already had the changes, because apparently what they do in the DSMs is as the copyrights get newer and newer, they make the changes as they go. So these tiny changes, you don't have to worry about them at all if your old book was 2015 or later. You've already read the changes. So those are the tiny ones that I just wanted to throw out there. There are some new diagnoses and clinical conditions we're going to go over today. There are some changes to wording and definitions we're going to go over today. And just know this DSM came out in May of 2022. So you might even be able to get a used copy now. So someone is saying the slides are not on this. Okay, the slides are on the screen. Okay. Alyssa's telling you all that the slides are on the screen. So if you can't see them, you might have to do a couple different things. So just know they're up there. All right. So I want all of you to get out your teal DSMs if you have them, and I am going to just I'm going to have you have this near you, and we're going to kind of pick it up and put it down and pick it up and put it down. So if you look in the front of your book, and if you go to the intellectual disabilities section, it's page 37. So it's page 37 in the teal book. This used to be called intellectual disabilities. What this new DSM-5 TR is doing is it's really focusing on language and labeling. And they even have a new section in the back that's talking about the racism and discrimination that's been throughout the old DSMs and how they're changing the language and labeling according to that. And that is in some of the fact sheets that I can talk about in a little bit. So on this very first slide, it's taking you through the changes, and then we're going to move to some of the changes in detail, and then we're going to look at the substance section. So intellectual disability changed to intellectual developmental disorder. Thank you, Sandra. Sandra said it's page 19 in the small book. So we are taking a lot of the language that sounds like disability. You won't see the word disability in the new DSM-5 TR as much. So if you are following along and you just joined in, we're on page 37, page 19 in the tiny book, and we've changed intellectual disability to intellectual developmental disorder. That's the feel you're going to see throughout the whole new DSM. These 4 different next bullets I'm not going to go over now, but I want you to write them down so that when you do deep dive into your 5 TR, just be mindful that there are going to be coding changes. You don't have to memorize the coding changes because they're in the DSM, but just know that bipolar coding, depression coding, substance coding in the notes, and OCD coding notes are a little bit different than the 5. So those are the 4 main bullet points that I want you to just be mindful of when it comes to coding, which means you don't have to memorize this now. It just means if you have a computer system at work where you just sort of click something in and the F code pops up, that might be outdated now in those 4 sections. So just know you might have to really kind of pay attention to those 4 sections. The coding is just a tiny bit different. And also know that we are all the way into ICD-10, so F codes only. So just kind of remember that. Adjustment disorder, you all remember that adjustment disorder used to have a chronic specifier. So put in the chat if you remember, you're old enough and been around enough that you remember when we used to be able to put a chronic specifier after adjustment disorder, which means the adjustment issue was chronic. And we kind of got away with leaving adjustment for a while longer than 6 months. You guys remember that? And then they took it away in the 5. They stole it from us. And now we're like, uh-oh, what do we do? In the 5 TR, they put back in the word persistent now as a specifier, and it's taking the place of chronic. So now we have this option of saying if the person's adjustment issue is ongoing, we can say persistent, and we can leave adjustment disorder longer than 6 months now. So those of you that are saying, yay, and I remember this is a big deal for those of us that do work with people that don't have a lot of pathology, but they come to us with adjustment issues. Now we can kind of hang out and in the adjustment disorder a little bit longer again, as long as we have a persistent specifier. So that's super exciting. Everybody in the chat that's going, yay, like, you know what I mean? We really needed that back. Gender dysphoria has some new language that we're going to go over today in the gender dysphoria section. Just know that folks that work in the LGBTQIA communities and they deep dive into the gender dysphoria section, they write letters for surgeries. I have someone that works under me, under my supervision, that does this work. As working with that population, what I've been told is that the changes they've made to the gender dysphoria section with the new language are way better, but not good enough. And that might be what you all notice. And someone's raising their hand, but you guys are totally on mute. So if your hand's raised, you got to talk to me in the chat. So you might notice that you really love the language and that it's getting better and better. Just know that as the DSM catches up with terms and language and labeling, as they catch up, I still feel like they might be 5 or 10 years behind. So just know that I really love some of these changes, but a lot of folks that work with these specific populations feel like it's not quite enough yet. So just kind of know that. And then the substance section has kind of what I call exploded with some new coding and new references to mental disorders. So when we deep dive into that section, I'm going to show you what that looks like. All right, I'm going to keep moving on unless I see questions in the chat. Okay, I would like all of you in your teal books to go to the back of the book, folks, and go to clinical conditions, which is on page 821. And then I also have the tiny book. I'm not sure where they are back in the tiny book, but if somebody has the tiny book and wants to throw that in the chat, I want to point out 2 brand new clinical conditions that are in the 5 TR that you all need to know. So just a little disclaimer about the clinical conditions. A lot of folks in the field don't use these much. And we didn't use these for many years because they don't get paid by insurance. So there are 2 reasons that we all go to the back of the book and look at clinical conditions. Reason number 1 is we want to highlight what the psychosocial stressors are that are next to the diagnosis because we took away the 5 axes. Thank you, Sandra. Page 305 in the small book, 821 in the big book. The reason we use clinical conditions is we want to highlight the psychosocial issues that are happening in the diagnosis because we took away the 5 axes. The other reason we look at clinical conditions is to use instead of diagnosis when there's no pathology, but we all know they're not paid for when we do it that way. I want to point out 2 new clinical conditions. So even if you're somebody that doesn't use these much, you do the diagnosis, you move on. Your narrative and your biopsychosocial show you the conditions, so you don't worry about the back of the book. I want you to go back into the back of the book, even if you're a seasoned clinician, and I want you to go back there and I want you to look on page 822. So maybe flip the page from 305 if you're in the small book, or maybe it's on 305. There's two new ones that I think is important to talk about here because they are moving in the direction of suicidal behavior. So if you look at these clinical conditions, these are two new ones. The first one is suicidal behavior, and it's called current suicidal behavior or history of suicidal behavior. And then the other one is non-suicidal self-injury. So when you have someone who has a trauma diagnosis or a depression diagnosis or an anxiety diagnosis, and their acuity level is super high, and you feel like there's a history of suicidal behavior and you want to highlight that next to the diagnosis now to show the high acuity level, now there's a code for that. If you are someone that wants to code non-suicidal self-injury next to a depression diagnosis, I no longer have to look through the narrative to find out how much the depression is causing functional impairment and how severe it is. You can now put major depressive disorder, most recent episode, severe, and then right next to it, you can put the code for non-suicidal self-injury. And now as a clinician working with that client, now I'm able to look at that diagnosis and say, okay, this person does a lot of self-harm. And so these new codes are super important if you're wanting to show high acuity level in your clients that struggle with suicidal behavior or non-suicidal self-injury. So if anybody has questions on these are brand new. Folks have asked me about the T, the Z, the R. Why are they different letters in front than a V code? If you've been around a long time, these are your old V codes. Remember V code of bereavement? It's like, no, it's grief, it's bereavement, it's not a depression diagnosis. Well, these are all your V codes now have different letters in front. And a lot of this section is similar to the old DSMs. These are the two new ones. A lot of you don't deep dive into this section, but I'm telling you, these two new ones might be two new codes you want to include in your diagnoses because they added them for a reason. When you look into the back of the DSM, and we're not going to do that today, and you see areas of research, like, oh, we're researching this for the next DSM. This is often where that all comes from. So there is a diagnosis in the area of research that says they're actually researching a diagnosis that is the non-suicidal self-injury, like a self-harm diagnosis, so that self-harm in the future may not just be part of the criteria or part of a personality disorder or part of a depression. Now it can be its own, maybe I'm thinking OCD, like an impulse control disorder, maybe it will be there. So these are two conditions to watch because in the future they could turn into a diagnosis. So that's something to think about. I don't see any questions right now. I'm thinking Alyssa will tell me if I freeze. So I'm hoping everybody's still with me. If you want to say hi, please do that. Okay, the next thing I want to highlight is when you are in the substance section, and we're going to look at it in a little bit together, there are 50 new coding updates for intoxication and withdrawal. Many of you don't even use those diagnoses. You just use use disorder and move on. That's what you do. But in this DSM, they're going to give us very specific directions, and I'm going to teach you in a little bit, that teach us how to code if someone's sitting in front of us has intoxication and a use disorder, or intoxication and withdrawal, and how we code that. And so I will highlight that for you in a little bit. Just know that if you haven't been in this section for a while, pay attention to the coding because it's a little different. Hello, everybody. Thank you for saying hi. So we'll get there in a minute. Just know that that's there. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about this new section. In the very back of this 5 TR, it's brand new. It's on page 859. Yes, the PowerPoints will be available on the website and emailed. On the back of 859, there's a brand new section in this book. It's something you absolutely could have skipped and you never would have known it, right? But this DSM wants you to pay attention to all the different language and labeling changes. So on 859, you'll see a brand new section called Culture and Psychiatric Diagnosis. That's what that brand new section is called. And it's talking about the cultural formulation, it says, and then it talks about a cultural formulation interview, which means it's giving you guides to put cultural implications inside of your biopsychosocial. So you're remembering to look through a window or a filter of remembering culture when you diagnose and background so that you don't overdiagnose. So if you go to the fact sheets on that website that I told you all about, if you really want to look closer at this, the fact sheets will highlight all of the little changes. And I'm going to just tell you right now, just a few of the different terms, and you don't need these terms to diagnose, but Alyssa put up the fact sheets in the chat. And what you're going to see on these fact sheets is a little bulleted list of where they switch some terms around to be mindful of discrimination, culture, and racism in the DSM. So this is all new. Sandra just said this is not in the small book, but significant to read. So if you have not been reading narrative for your career for a while, this is a big deal because it's talking to us about how there's two things going on. They're changing the language in the DSM to pay attention to labeling. They are also paying attention to new research. So when you look in the course and prevalence part to each DSM diagnosis, you may notice there's some new research. So we're not just doing research on a certain population for that diagnosis. We are now having a broader research base. So some of the things that have changed that I'll just point out now is the term racialized is used instead of race and racial to highlight the socially constructed nature of race. The term ethno-racial is used in the text to denote the US Census categories. This is the most interesting one to me, and you can print out all these fact sheets for yourselves. The term minority and non-white are avoided because they describe social groups in relation to a racialized majority that perpetuates hierarchies. So minority and non-white are going to be gone from this new DSM. They also, the new term Latinx in place of Latino, Latina to promote gender inclusive terminology. So see, these are some of the things that you may not have realized because maybe you're not reading all the narrative anymore, but there's this big section in the back and then the narrative throughout the DSM is important. So, all right. Alyssa, folks are still saying that they don't know what to do about the CEUs. Harold says, I've still have problems with the addition of racism and discrimination as an add-on instead of an essential part of practice. There could also be an emphasis in culturally and linguistically appropriate standards. I absolutely agree. I can't believe that we even have to have a section on this. But the good news is there's a section to tell you what we should already be doing. I absolutely agree. But the section then, I think, kind of reminds us to go back and read the narrative. Don't just look at the criteria and diagnose anymore. Look at the narrative and see what the narrative is telling us to do about language and labeling, because we have to infuse that language and labeling into our session with our clients so that we're using the appropriate terminology now, which is super important. Yes, and it's definitely evidence of our lack of progress in this area. This is sort of the disclaimer I said early on. Everything that's different and changing is like, yeah, this should have been going on all along. and it's all going to feel like it's 10 years behind, but here we are. So that's really good. At least we're telling people who are opening the DSM, hey, be mindful of race, discrimination, background, culture, pay attention to the filters that you look through. In my DSM class, I do a whole class on biases and filters, and I ask people to talk about the filters they look through, because at the end of the day, we are all subjectively evaluating people, and we're saying that it's an objective measure with all our lists, but all this narrative is reminding us that it's a subjective science. And, 10 people could give a different diagnosis to a client because of our interpretation. So this new DSM is sort of reminding us of that. Be mindful of a cultural lens, be mindful of the language and labeling you're using. And they even give us examples of how to ask questions about culture, which I feel like I've been doing that to my class for 20 years, but now the DSM is telling us to do that. So I absolutely feel like all of you should make sure that you jump into that website and look at those fact sheets, and it'll highlight kind of what I'm talking about today. And that will be a really good reference for all of you. Is there any chance that codependence will be included as a valid diagnosis? It was first proposed in the DSM-3. I think codependence, Vivian, so this is my knowledge of this, and I'm only giving you, I always like to say I feel like I know a lot about what I know about, and I don't know anything else. This is what I know about codependence since I'm an addiction specialist. They've always, the problem with the term codependence is that sometimes we end up being a little bit over stereotyping on women with codependence, and women get over labeled with codependence. And so there's been a lot of research on how to not over diagnose women when it comes to dependent personality disorder, because what the research is telling us is if there's a lot of codependence, look at that as a personality disorder. But I know that codependence is created from being in a relationship with someone that kind of it's created. It's more of a behavior than a personality. And so I think it's just, it's not a diagnosis. It's just a behavior that is occurring, the codependent behavior that might be under the umbrella of almost any diagnosis. I think folks with codependent tendencies might have a trauma diagnosis, might have a depression diagnosis, might have an anxiety diagnosis. So I would say if you feel like there's codependence in someone, pay attention to what the actual pathology is, because codependence isn't pathology. Codependence is something that's kind of born out of a relationship. So that's perhaps why they've never made it, I'm guessing, a diagnosis. Great question. All right, so let's talk about some, yes, and it's also associated with stigmatizing language. That's where the stereotyping comes in. Harold, I would also add that each of our professions now has an emphasis on the impact of racism and discrimination and the need to use our ethical standards as well as the work that's being done to emphasize this. Absolutely. Thank you for throwing that up there. I'm also an ethics trainer, and whenever I train on ethics, we really talk about this. So keep throwing things in the chat, all of you. These are really great reminders, and I really appreciate the reminders. All right, next change we're going to look at is, do you all remember? Okay, I'm gonna have you all, it says my internet connection is unstable, so someone tell me if I freeze again, and then I'll know it. I want all of you to put up in the chat if you remember when depression and bipolar were underneath one section in the DSM, mood disorders. Put up in the chat if you remember mood disorders. And then, yeah, I hated that. I mean, having depression and bipolar separate is the best. So if you remember, oh, look at my old people. I love all my old people. So if you remember mood disorders, you remember when they had mood disorder NOS. Do you all remember NOS? And then the 5 came in and we separated it and did other and unspecified. You all remember that? I have somebody in the Q&A. Whoever's asking questions in the Q&A, jump into the chat, because I'm only looking at the chat. I can't man everything, you guys. I'm like magical, but like not that magical. So throw your questions in the chat. So if you remember NOS, And then you remember mood disorder going away. But now you know that bipolar and depression are separate, and every section has other and unspecified. Now we're going back in. So let's go to the depression section. And I'm going to count on Sandra, my trusty mini book person, to tell me where we're going to go. So if you're going to go to the depression section, you're going to page, I don't know, like around 183, but I'm flipping for a second because I'm going to get to mood disorder. They added unspecified mood disorder back into the DSM. So they took this away, you guys, because when we went to bipolar and depression, we had other specified depression, other specified bipolar, unspecified depression, unspecified bipolar, page 81 in the baby book. Now, in both the depression section and in the bipolar section, it gives us an option of unspecified mood disorder. So they basically put it back in for this DSM. So this is when, so unspecified diagnoses are only used as placeholders. I don't know if everybody knows that, but I'm going to throw it out. They're only used as placeholders. So when you do an unspecified diagnosis, it's usually in an emergency setting, an emergency assessment, ER setting, hospital setting, and we give unspecified because we just don't know, but they need an F code to be billed. So unspecified depression means somebody might be suicidal and they're going into inpatient and we don't know what kind of depression yet. So we just give them unspecified depression. Unspecified has to change. Other does not. Other can be a unique presentation. Unspecified mood disorder is saying we don't know if it's bipolar or depression. We are in an emergent situation. We don't know if it's bipolar or depression. This person's kind of up and down. They have labile mood. They're irritable. We don't know if it's a mixed episode. We don't know if it's just depression. So now we are putting back in unspecified mood disorders. We don't know which section we're in, is basically what it's saying. Everybody get that? So if you don't remember, other is for unique presentation. Other is when they have a mixed bag of different criteria from the section, but don't meet full criteria for any specific diagnosis, but they have their own unique presentation of a mixed bag criteria. That's other. Other is also when, man, there's functional impairment and man, the symptoms are bad, but that hasn't been going on quite long enough. That might be other. Other can stay because someone can always be unique, or other can change. After a few weeks, you're like, oh gosh, they do have full mood episodes. This is major depressive disorder. This isn't other. So other can be a mixed bag and stay, or other can change. Unspecified always has to change. And the new DSM-5 TR added unspecified mood disorder when we have an emergent situation and we don't know if it's bipolar or depression. Everybody good? Any questions about that? Throw them up in the chat if you have questions. I feel like I'm up to date. Let's see. Awesome. So they have this unspecified mood disorder in the bipolar section and into the depression section. If anybody has questions, let me know. And if we don't have any questions, we're going to move to the next change. I'm going to move through the changes and then we'll settle on looking in the substance section. I am not giving a formal break today because you all have 2 hours of CEUs and we didn't do a formal break. So you all know where the bathrooms are because, you know, you're home. All right. Questions. Let's pause. Does other need to be changed within 6 months? Other never needs to be changed if somebody absolutely has a unique presentation. For example, if I have a client who has a couple criteria from persistent and a couple criteria from major, but they don't really meet full criteria for any depression, it's their own unique kind of depression, that may stay forever. But if I have someone that presents like that, but then in about 2 months they come in and you're like, oh, you actually did have a full mood episode. We just didn't know it back then because you didn't tell me. Then you change it. So you don't ever have to change other if whatever their other situation is continues. And that's just their own unique way of showing their diagnosis. Yes, those delineations are for every single section. I just taught them in this section because I highlighted that unspecified mood disorder was back. So hopefully that helped. Awesome. Okay, great questions, you guys. Thanks for asking questions and talking to me, so I know you're all still there. I can't even tell you how weird it is to not look at anybody or look at myself. I'm literally teaching into my wall. So it's super weird. All right, let's go to the next section. We're going to go to the gender dysphoria section. And you don't have to turn to the section if you don't want to. I am not going to turn to it, but if you do want to turn to it, then you certainly can. And it is on, for the big book, page 512, 511, 512 for the little book, Sandra will tell us. So these, thank you, Sandra. Sandra's going to have to, we're going to have a little like email, hello, meet and greet. Have to give you a little bit of a kickback. Changes to language around gender and gender identity. So I want you to remember that they're trying. I kind of feel like this section went wah, wah, like we could have done a lot better. But just a little disclaimer about this section. This section is, you know, super sensitive, super controversial. A lot of folks feel like this section might turn into a situation. If you all remember the DSM-3, homosexuality was a diagnosis. We called it pathology in the 3. So now we're now saying that someone with a gender identity issue that causes dysphoria, we're saying that it's pathology and not just identity. And so there's some controversy around the fact that we have to label somebody in order to get them surgery. But at the end of the day, I'm just going to show you what the changes are and not necessarily deep dive into what I like about them or what I don't like about them. So changes to language around gender and gender identity. They went from desired gender, because that connotates choice, to experience gender, which connotates how they feel, how they were born, what they're experiencing. It reminds me of when I was in my MSW program, and all of the books in the early 90s talked about being gay as a sexual preference. And I remember quoting that and my professor circling that in red and saying, it's not a preference, it's who we are, it's not what we prefer. So that reminds me of that. I'll never forget it. I always say red pens are scary, but I'll never forget this because she had a red pen around every single time I said that. So desired gender is now experienced gender. And I'm going to look at all your messages in a second. So give me a sec and then I'm going to peek. Cross-sex medical procedure is now gender affirming medical procedure. Natal male, native female is now individual assigned male, female at birth. And if you know that lingo, that's how we are saying it now, assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth. So these are the changes they've made to the language in that section. All right. Oh, thanks, Lisa. All right. They should add post-traumatic slave. Oh, they would make. Okay, good, good, good. Are you guys talking about the big? Someone said the big book. I'm wondering if you're talking about the AA book, big book. And remember, the AA big book was written in 1935. So that language is something. Like if I had to talk about language and labeling in the big book, there's a chapter 2, the wives, which connotates that it's all men reading the big book. The training is being recorded. Cheryl said, I encourage clinicians to look that up if you deal with Black Americans. Very informative. All the language can be confusing. Awesome. Thanks for talking to me, everybody. AA, yes. Just as a side note, since you all mentioned the AA Big Book, they make so many new addendums now. I love Stephanie Covington for the Woman's Way Through the 12 Steps. They have the Jewish Way Through the 12 Steps, the Buddhist Way Through the 12 Steps. I mean, there's so many versions now. If you didn't know that, Just know that. So that's super important. All right. All right. Cool. All right. Going to the next. Here is our brand new diagnosis. This is the only brand new diagnosis that is in the DSM-5 TR. If you see any other diagnosis that you're like, this is new, it's not new. It was maybe new to the 5, but the only diagnosis that is added to this DSM is in the trauma section. So when I first heard that prolonged grief disorder has been added, I was looking in the depression section, because in the entire depression section, we are being told, make sure it's not grief, make sure it's not grief, make sure it's not grief. So I'm looking, I couldn't find it. And it's in the trauma section, which makes sense to me, because it's pretty traumatic to be grieving for 12 months or more. And that's what this is. So someone just said prolonged grief disorder is a complex. Absolutely. So page 130 in the small book. And then if you are opening your big book, big book, that's why you guys are making fun of me and saying big book. That was good. I just got it. So I'm slow. If you're opening your larger DSM, then you're going to open to the trauma section. And I'm looking, I haven't memorized all the page numbers yet. What happened to me in the old DSM is I was memorizing page numbers, and then my brain was filled with stuff I never needed again. So you're going to go to page, I'm kind of in 303 now, and I'm looking for, oh, it says 332 on my slide. How about that? Maybe I should look at my own slides. Go to 322. At the very bottom is prolonged grief disorder. You guys are so funny. You're like 322, and I just looked up on my slide and I'm like, oh, I even wrote that. So look on 322 at the bottom, prolonged grief disorder. This is new. The death at least 12 months ago of a person who was close to the bereaved individual. For kids and adolescents at least 6 months ago. So some of the language in this DSM, look really, really closely at the tiny words I like to say. It used to be just kids. Now it says kids and adolescents. So adolescents have more consideration for needing to feel symptoms less time in this DSM. So don't forget to look at the parentheses. Don't forget to look where it says note. Don't forget to look at the little things, because it's really important. So prolonged grief disorder, 12 months or longer since the death, the development of a persistent grief response. So this is the trauma response, characterized by one or both of the following symptoms. If you all have ever done any grief work, I think most of my grief specialists would agree that grief work is trauma work. I mean, that's what I feel. It seems to go together. Oh, you're grieving trauma. Oh, there's trauma. Is there grief? It always seems to go hand in hand. So it really makes sense. This diagnosis makes sense. So I'm looking in here. And so since the death, it's been a persistent grief response, intense yearning, preoccupation with thoughts or memories of the deceased person. Since the death, at least 3 of the following have been going on, and there's 8 criteria. So identity disruption, marked sense of disbelief about the death, avoidance of reminders that the person is dead, intense emotional pain, difficulty reintegrating, emotional numbness, feeling that life is meaningless, intense loneliness. So it says make sure they're not better explained by major depression or PTSD. So you're doing the same differential diagnosis work as you are in the old DSM, but this one to me is giving us, I think of diagnosis all the time on a continuum. And when I think of grief on a continuum, I've always thought of bereavement as the clinical condition that's right after typical grief. Then I think of the adjustment disorder diagnosis, having trouble adjusting to the grief. And then I think of depression and anxiety. And then there's always something that was kind of missing. And this is that kind of, this has been going on now too long. And it gives you this option of doing trauma work with a grieving person. So it really makes sense to throw this diagnosis in. And this is, so word on the street, I'm not a grief specialist. I am an addiction specialist, but word on the street, all my grief specialist colleagues say they really do like this diagnosis. They feel like it's time. I will tell you, my head's been in these DSMs for 20 years. I like this one. I feel like at least now we're paying attention to labeling and language. I think it's giving us these like, hey, make sure you do this, and hey, make sure you do that. And the old DSMs never did that. And so I encourage all of you, if you haven't done this in a long time, when you diagnose someone, read the narrative, read the course and prevalence. There's so many clues in the course and prevalence with time and severity. And then pay attention to the differential diagnosis. I always tell my students the last stop on the train before you diagnose someone is read all the diagnoses that look similar to the one you're looking at. So this is super important. Yeah, Heather, I am so glad now too that they have this. I will just give a tiny disclaimer. I tried to code someone with this and the insurance kicked it out. So I don't know that insurance panels, maybe now they do, but a couple months ago, we couldn't use this code. And so this is what I want to highlight for you all. See how the code says F43.8? See how it says that? Well, the F code for other specified trauma also says 43.8. So for whatever reason, I think if it's other, for whatever reason, it kicked it out. But if you look up prolonged grief disorder now, I think it's 43.89. So if you're getting kicked out, do some research on how some of these, this is the brand new DSM, and sometimes I see that a little bit of a code double dip like that, and it shouldn't be that way. So I believe prolonged grief disorder is now pulling up in systems as 8.89. Is there a person who has prolonged grief and the individual was killed violently and the individual is at risk for being a victim? Would we also diagnose prolonged grief and PTSD? You absolutely can do comorbidity with PTSD. If they meet criteria for PTSD and they meet criteria for prolonged grief, those criteria aren't going to double dip much because prolonged grief is all about grieving the loss and PTSD is all about being traumatized from the loss. So you absolutely can have both. In fact, Lakeisha, on the bottom of 327 under comorbidity, it says, remember, there's a comorbidity section after differential diagnosis. The most common comorbid disorders with symptoms of prolonged grief are major depressive disorder, PTSD, and substance. So there's your answer. It's very often going to sit next to it. So differential diagnosis, normal grief. I don't know why it doesn't say typical grief. If you all have noticed, the word normal has been kind of leaving the station in the DSM, and you hear about the word typical a little bit more. But it looks like the DSM is still behind on that PC term. DSM is clinical term, and then PC terms may not find their way into the DSM. So it still says normal in the DSM, but in the clinical world, we use typical. The TR, so when the TR can be clinically used, we are using the TR now. It absolutely can be used. You just have to make sure your system is updated for the new codes. That prolonged grief disorder is a brand new diagnosis. So I think it just took insurance companies a minute to recognize it. So I just wanted to highlight that for all of you. If anybody has a question in the question and answer section, throw it in the chat because that's the only thing I have open. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second, take a breath. Okay, so Vicky found on a Google search that it's 43.81. Okay, so there it is. They want you to put a 1 behind it now. When I looked it up 6 months ago, it was 9. So kind of just know that sometimes that's going to happen as the codes are going to float around and they're going to be different sometimes. So 43.81 is prolonged grief. And then 43.8 is other trauma. So almost the same, and make sure you're paying attention to that. Thanks, everybody. I do love the interaction. Okay. I want to go now to the other slides. Oop, this is perfect. I wanted to spend an hour on each section. So before I pop into the other slides for the substance use section, because I told you all that's what we would be doing today, I want to highlight one more thing that I'm now remembering in the last training that I did. Someone said, I didn't know that. And so I'm just going to highlight it, even though it was a change from the 4 TR to the 5. So you kind of should know this. I want to throw this just little fact out there, and I throw this out at the bottom of these slides as sort of a highlighted warning that if you didn't read the narrative changes from the 4 TR to the 5, then you missed this, and it's a major miss. So if you all have your teal books, I want you to turn to the bipolar I disorder, and I want you to turn to at the bottom of 141, at the very bottom of 141 under major depressive episode, it says note. And I want you all to get there. Yes, we asked all of you to bring your DSMs today. So I think we did do that. I'm so sorry if you forgot or if you didn't bring it, but I promise all this will be available to you guys. If you go to the bottom of 141 and it says note, criterion A through C constitute a major depressive episode. Major depressive episodes are common in bipolar I, but are not required for a diagnosis of bipolar I. That was a major change. What that's saying is you can be bipolar I and only having had a manic episode. You don't have to have had a major depressive episode anymore. So that's an example of, hey, read the notes, because if your eyes are just scanning and you're like, oh, looks the same, you're going to miss the notes. And basically, if you didn't know that for since 2013, the last 10 years of the DSM-5, that's been around for 10 years. And I just had a student correct in their field placement. They were in a hospital setting and they corrected the head psychiatrist, and the head psychiatrist didn't know. So, oops. All right, what are you guys asking me? In my experience, when would they change the DSM-5 TR again? Because after recently buying the 5 TR was released in a short time. So the 5 has been around since 2013. So the 5T, it took 9 years for the 5 TR to come out. So just to kind of throw that out, it did take 9 years. So if you just bought the 5, you just might not have known that it's been out. But the 4 TR changed to the 5 in 2013. And now the 5 changed to the 5 TR in 2022. So it did take 9 years. So in my experience, it's always between 5 and 10 years is what I researched and have noticed. So you at least are going to have this new one 5 years plus. How to differentiate between PC terms and medical terms? That's nowhere in the DSM. It's because politically correct terms are not really part of a DSM training because it's with the climate, right? And sometimes I don't even know the recent PC term until someone tells it to me, because I maybe not be in that specific culture or population to know that we don't call it that anymore. But I will say that one of the terms that has been floating around as PC is normal is now typical. And then in the autism world, I'm sure all of you have heard the term neurodiverse and how there's a whole kind of political, cultural push to pay attention to autism in a way that it's just thinking in a different way. It's not pathology. It's more diversity than it is pathology. So all of that cultural implications, politically correct terms, what are people saying now about language, that's going to shift and change on any given day. The clinical terms are just going to change every time there's a new DSM. So there might be a PC term you hear that's not in the DSM. The other term that I like to point out as we move into the substance section is that how many people say addicts and alcoholics, and how that's nowhere in the DSM anywhere. And so the language and labeling, so the climate of the DSMs, as the DSMs have changed, they have gone from gone into person first language. So from the 4 TR to the 5, we started saying person with schizophrenia, person with autism, instead of a schizophrenic or someone who is autistic. But PC and cultural terms, if you ask someone with autism, if they are a person with autism, they'll say, I'm autistic. So sometimes in our efforts to be person first, we don't really ask folks from that group what they would like to be called. And really, at the end of the day, there's so much diversity within diversity. If one person might say they like this and one person might say they like this, so we're never going to be perfect. I think the end of the day, it's always asking the client how they would like to be talked to, labeled, discussed, and always talking about, neurodivergent, neurodivergent, identity first language. So neurodivergent movement uses identity first language, I am autistic, whereas thank you for Erica for saying that in that really great sentence. The DSM would say person with autism, but the movement says I am autistic. So we can't know everything. I always say being culturally aware is when you are mindful that you have to pay attention, you have to ask questions, you have to know what you need to research. Being culturally competent is probably impossible. We can't always know everything all the time. It's just staying open to all that new language coming in. So do we go through the old DSM when we purchase the new one? No, please don't. Do we throw out the old DSM? You do. I mean, yeah, Nita, throw it out. It took me like 5 years to throw out the 4 TR because it was so well loved. It kind of makes me feel icky to throw stuff out. The only reason I haven't thrown out mine is because I teach about the changes, but absolutely throw it out. I mean, unless you have notes in it that you want to transfer your notes first. When I teach DSM class, I tell all my folks to take notes in their DSM because no one's bringing a notebook to an assessment. You're only bringing your DSM. Okay. So John said that's the difference between person first and person centered language. You know what, John? I don't know. If anybody knows the answer to that question, person first language. So person first might be calling someone saying I'm autistic, and person centered might be saying a person with autism. If anyone knows the difference, please put it in the chat because I don't, and I'm not going to pretend like I do. Yes, 12-step groups continue to use addict and alcoholic. In fact, if you are someone in recovery, you would maybe argue, and you're a real 12-step person and you're entrenched in the 12-step community, they might say, well, we took the label back because by saying I'm an alcoholic or I'm a recovering alcoholic, I'm proud of that. It's not a bad thing. And so you'll hear communities do that. They'll own back the language to kind of change it in their minds. So you're right. It's hard to sometimes know. I have my 4 TR for the same reason. I know, you just feel like you can't throw it out. Okay, Bridget, identity first language is I'm autistic, person centered is person with autism. Thank you. I learned something new today. Person centered, ask the person what they want, right? So at the end of the day, we ask. So awesome discussion. Thank you, everybody. Julie said, I kind of just got my 5. It says asking someone what they prefer allows them to self-define and create such empowerment. So, and I am a big believer, by the way, in talking about diagnosis with your client. I can't tell you how many clients come to me after having had other therapists and they're like, I don't know why I'm on this medicine. I don't know what my diagnosis is. And maybe it's not always important to say, this is what your diagnosis is. But if it becomes part of the direct exchange, I think that's really important. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go to my substance slides. Hold on a second. Do you all see the changes to the substance section now?
No, we see a picture of you in
Oh, you see my
okay.
friends?
Yeah.
Oh, let's stop share and reshare. Hello, everybody. At least it's a nice picture and not like a, not nice picture. All right. Hold on a second, everyone. I'm going to reshare some new slides. And yes, you will get all of these slides. Do we see now? Better?
Yep, just put it in presentation mode and then you should be great.
Perfect. Yep. I'm almost there. It's really good when I have someone telling me what to do. In my life, I'm always the one telling everyone what to do. And I'm really glad that I don't have to be that person today. Okay, so let me see what you guys said, and then we're going to jump back into the slides. Sometimes the professional community trying not to offend, adorning too much the labels and ending up making it more offensive. Absolutely. Agree, especially when diagnosing a personality disorder, talk about it. Patients learn a lot when they recognize that they have one or not alone, and then they can work on it 100%. All right. Okay. So I'm going to let Alyssa answer the certification, like businessy questions, and I'm just going to stick with answering the content questions, and we're going to move to the changes. Okay. So these slides say, and I'm just telling you what these are the changes. So these are my slides that I created when the 4 TR changed to the 5. That's when the major changes happen. So those are the slides I'm giving you to highlight some of the things that you may not have read or noticed as they changed. The only changes from the 5 to the 5 TR, and tell me if this is confusing. The only changes from the 5 to the 5 TR are some language, like I've been talking to you guys about, some language in the very beginning paragraph or narrative, which there may not be a lot of the narrative in the small book, but in the big book, in the large book, on page 543, there are some changes to the language and labeling from the 5 to the 5 TR. There are also changes when you code. And I don't really feel like I have to teach you what the coding changes are, because you just follow the directions. So I'm going to go over the language that's different from the 5 to the 5 TR. And then we're going to look at some of this coding stuff that happened in the 5 that you may not even know about. So right now, Jen and Alyssa are talking in the chat about the businessy stuff, and I'm going to kind of move forward with the substance stuff. So if you're looking at 543, you'll see it says the substance, and right now I know I have a slide up, but everybody look down in your books if you have them. You'll see it says the substance-related disorders. And you'll see a big giant paragraph. That first paragraph's the same. The second paragraph is new. So I don't really even know if that's super important that you see this new second paragraph. But I'm just going to read it to you anyway, because it's new and you may not have known that it was different or new if I didn't tell you. So this is what it says. Note that the phrase drug addiction is not applied as a diagnostic term in this classification, although it's in common usage in many countries to describe severe problems related to compulsive and habitual use of substances. There it is, the language. They're saying, by the way, calling someone a drug addict is not a diagnosis, which, by the way, that wasn't ever a diagnosis in any DSM, but in this DSM, they're waving their hands about this language and labeling stuff. That's what's really important. That's what's really important. So note that the phrase drug addiction is not applied. Then there's one other new little part. If you go to the bottom of 543, and the very last paragraph talks about, it's guiding you to paying attention to the coding. The substance-related disorders are divided into 2 groups, substance use disorders and substance-induced disorders. That's new language. So it's guiding you towards paying attention to the substance-induced disorders. So I'm gonna give a little disclaimer. I believe that every single person that diagnoses, even if you're not an addiction specialist, needs to be a mini substance specialist, needs to be a mini one, because every diagnosis separate from this section demands that you rule out substance use. If you look at the list of criteria, in the list it says, rule out substance, rule out medication, rule out medical condition. Why does it do that? Because every single substance could create mental issues with an etiological link, which means if I drink all day, every day, it's probably going to sit on my serotonin, and that central nervous system depressant is probably going to make me depressed. And so when I have someone in front of me, if they've never been depressed in the past and now they're depressed, maybe they have the substance-induced kind. Maybe they have the substance-induced kind. So yes, so my slides are their slides from the 5, but everything I'm showing you is current. It's all the change. It's the same. So don't worry. Everything I'm teaching you today is what you need to know. It says 5 because these are the things that are the same from the 5 to the 5 TR, but that are coding stuff that you may not have ever read, So all of the coding, some of the coding, like the F codes are going to be different in this DSM, but I don't need to put those on a slide. It's just going to guide you. But all of these slides, even though they say 5, I should probably just put 5 TR not to confuse you guys. So thank you for the learning lesson. These are all current. So just pretend they say 5 TR, just pretend, and that's my mistake, because all these are current rules. These are just rules that you may not have paid attention to that I'm going to highlight today because they're very weird and different. All right. So Margaret just said, sadly, substance use disorders impact so many things. So at the end of the day, knowing how to ask about substance issues, knowing how to ask about every single drug, and I can just give you a mini little tip on how I do that, and then we can deep dive into some of this weird coding stuff. When I ask about substance issues, I have a whole entire list, and I didn't give it to you guys today because we're talking about changes, not how I do biopsychosocials, but I have a list of all the drugs. And I don't say to somebody, I don't use an open-ended question. I use closed-ended questions. I don't say to someone, tell me about the substances that you use, because they'll just say none, like they won't answer. So what I want you to think about is, this is what I do. And I'm going to give you guys this tip. And after I give you guys this tip, you're going to do it. And you're going to find out more about drug and alcohol stuff with your clients than you've ever figured out before. And then you're going to not know what to do about all this new information. I go down each drug and I say to my clients, can you just give me an idea, a yes or no answer? I mean, when do we ever do closed-ended questions? Never. Give me a yes or no answer if you've ever experimented or tried the substance that I say. And I go down the whole list. Ever experimented or tried? Ever experimented or tried? Because nobody is afraid to say they've experimented with something. They'll all say yes, because that's not a big deal. Oh, I've experimented with it. Instead of just talking about the drug or alcohol they came to talk about, or instead of just asking about substances they've ever tried and they say none, and then you move on, go down through a list. It's very, very hard to withhold information. It's really hard to withhold information when asked a direct question. It's very easy to omit. It's very hard to withhold information by commission. So I go down all the drugs and I ask if they've ever experimented with it. And they say yes or no. And then I go back to the yeses and I say, have an idea about how many times maybe you remember experimenting with it. And I once had a girl say, oh, about 40 times. And I was like, that's a little more than experimenting. But she came in to talk about using too much marijuana. And now I just caught that she used ecstasy 40 times, and she never would have told me that. But because I went down, that really, really, really helped them not be able to withhold information. So all of a sudden, experiment turns into 40 times, and now I know a little bit more about what's going on. So the reason it's important to know if someone's using ecstasy or Molly or any hallucinogen is that if you're doing that and you have depression, you are at risk for suicidal thoughts or feelings, because that plummets your serotonin. So this is one of the tips I give my addiction students when I teach about addiction. I tell them to have a list of drugs, ask about experimenting, ask about how many times maybe they've experimented, then ask about age of onset, like when's the first time you did it? And that helps me start to deep dive into whether or not it's substance induced or whether or not the clinical issue stands alone. Because once we go into this section, we have to know whether it's substance induced or whether or not it stands alone. Margaret just said it takes time, but worth the information. You know what, Margaret? It doesn't take as much time as you think, because once you get real good at just asking and then quickly, it really goes pretty quickly. And when you go down the list, someone said, when's the last time you used it? And that is really, really helpful. You know what else I do, Lisa, to normalize is I'll just say, can you just give me an idea of how often you drink alcohol? Instead of saying, do you drink alcohol? Because you're just making it like normal that we drink. Just tell me how often. I also ask somebody's favorite drink. I'll say, what's your favorite drink? Because that connotates you're allowed to have a favorite drink and I'm not judging you for drinking. Like, hey, what's your favorite? That really helps when asking about beer. Because remember the old days when like beer was 4% or 5% alcohol? Now, if somebody has one beer, it could be 10% or 20%. Oh my gosh, you guys, I tried a beer a couple weeks ago that someone said was like 18%. I took one sip. I'm like, that's ridiculous. That's horrible. So I want you to ask about that. What's your favorite? Because the high octane beer is different than the lower one. So as we're getting into this section of the DSM, one of the most important things for you to be able to do is know whether it's substance induced or not, because this new section in the 5 TR wants you to pay attention to that more than ever. Because when you have a substance induced mental issue, when the substance is gone, the mental issue is gone. Yay! Alcohol-induced depression, within 4 to 6 weeks, it lifts. Yay, we don't have to treat depression. So chicken or egg, right? If someone has depression when they're 6 and it runs in their family, that depression might stay. But if someone's never had depression and they've been drinking all day, every day, maybe it's substance-induced. Those are really important distinguishing things as we dive into this section, because substance-induced mental disorders are highlighted now in the 5 TR. So it's really important to know how to ask those questions. So when we get into this section, we know what we're doing. All right, let's see. Oop. Somebody is asking me in the chat, how do you best approach elders who now seek further opioid prescriptions and cannot see that they may have a use disorder? Oh my gosh, Cynthia, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. And if we have time at the end, we'll talk about that. I actually do a training on chronic pain and addiction and talk about older adults and substance, and we talk all about that. So it's not quite within the scope of this training, but I would love to talk about it. So just kind of hold on that if you could. So where can I find a list of substances with current street names? So there used to be, I would go on the SAMHSA website first, SAM. Oh, hold on, this says directly. I'm going to make sure this goes to everybody. I would go to samhsa.org. So try the SAMHSA website first. There used to be a website called drugabuse.com, but I think it's gone. So I think drug abuse, oh, wait. I'm gonna look it up. Jen or Alyssa, can you look up drugabuse.com, drugabuse.org, something like that for me? Because there is a book that they used to sell under drugabuse.com, but now I think it's .org. Oh, it's samhsa.gov. Sorry. Thank you, everybody. samhsa.gov. There used to be a website that you could buy a yearly book of all the street names, of all the drugs. It was like a shiny, any of my addiction specialists remember this book. It's like a shiny book, and Operation Street Smart guys would show us the book. and it's new every year, and it's all the drugs and really shiny descriptions. And then it gave us all the street names. Cody said, I do. Cody, if you're in the mood, will you look for that website for me if you want to? If you don't want to, no big deal. Drugabuse.gov is one. Okay, awesome. Thank you, everybody. So that can be helpful. And that could really, I don't always recommend using street names with young people because then they know I'm full of it, because they know I would never use a street name. So you have to be genuine with the names you would use. I will say that I don't say marijuana or cannabis, I say weed. And if any of you, I'm almost 51, so I called it pot. Don't call it pot. Nobody calls it pot. They're going to ask you what the heck. So so someone said, I guess where it depends on where you live. In Columbus, Ohio, it's weed now. So just so you know, if anybody, okay, just for fun, before I show you these slides, because we have plenty of time, if anybody wants to put in the chat, what is the current like terminology for marijuana where you are from? Is it weed where you're from, or are you all calling it something different now? Doja, cart, wacky tobacco. Who calls it wacky tobacco? That is not even true. Loud. Oh, that's so interesting. Gas, green, gun. This is so interesting. Okay. Some of you are calling it loud. Where are you from that you're calling it loud? And I know carts are a specific type, but we just call it weed. Oh my gosh, that's so interesting. Oh, okay. That was fun. I'm trying to make having 500 people on a training fun. So it's fun to see where you guys are from and what you call it. I don't say loud, but in Illinois, I hear loud a lot. So carts and dabs are everywhere. 420, Zaza. That's interesting. Moda in Spanish. Okay, those of you saying gas or crackle, tell me where they're from. That's so interesting. I think at the end of the day, if we call it weed, we're all good. Chicago. Okay. Huh. All right. Awesome. Okay. As you guys are playing around, you work in a prison. So prison language might be a whole culture in and of itself, just to throw that out there. Prison culture, gang culture, adolescent culture, everyone has their own. So it might be region, and it might be culture, and it might be background. So loud is specific by the smell. It has a skunky smell. All right, awesome. Yeah. I don't even try to stay hip anymore, you guys, because I'm old now. Like that ship has sailed. Like I'm not hip. I mean, I have a whole arm sleeve of tattoos, which helps. But other than that, like that's just smoke and mirrors. I'm an old lady. Okay. So substance and other addictive disorders is the new name, which includes gambling disorder. Substance abuse and dependence have been gone since the 4 TR. Now it's substance use disorder, mild, moderate, severe. This is the coding weirdness that I want to throw in there to have you guys pay attention to, because you may not have known this for the last 10 years. If intoxication or withdrawal is comorbid with a use disorder, you code under intoxication or withdrawal. So it's super weird. I'm going to talk about that. So I want to talk about that for a second. And because the coding is very funky, Cheryl said, what list do I use? I use a made up list in Columbus, Ohio. So I always tell people your list of drugs should be a list for what's going on in your area. So I make up my list. I always put alcohol and marijuana on the top of the list, and then the big scary drugs on the bottom, because people are more apt to say yes or no to the less scary than the more scary. Okay. Gloria, if someone is driving in front of you, the smell loud will come into your vehicle and will appear that you are the one smoking. How about that? Okay, so let me tell you about the weird coding stuff that you may not know. In the new DSM, let me tell you where these coding directions are, because this is weird coding stuff. Let me tell you where it is. Okay. Look at the bottom of 549. Okay, Jeffrey, you're asking about in remission. We'll look at that in a sec. Thank you. Awesome question. Look at the bottom of 549. If you have the new TR DSM, at the bottom of 549, it says recording procedures. So these are the weird coding that you want to pay attention to for substance intoxication and substance withdrawal. Now, someone gets a diagnosis of substance intoxication if they're in front of you intoxicated. Someone gets a diagnosis of substance withdrawal if they're in front of you in withdrawal. If they're not in front of you and intoxicated, and they're not in front of you and in withdrawal, move those away, go into the use disorders, start fresh. But if you work in a place like the ER or a place where they come in under the influence, this is where the new coding stuff is important to know. You need to be mindful of. So if somebody, like a MAT clinic, absolutely. If somebody is sitting in front of you and they're intoxicated and they also have a use disorder, which may not be the case. Like someone could get a DUI and not have a use disorder. It could be an oops. Someone could be, in trouble and talking to you and intoxicated, but it not be addictive yet, or a use disorder yet, or a mild disorder. It could just be they're drunk. So you can diagnose intoxication without anything else. And you can diagnose withdrawal without anything else. You know why? Someone can be in withdrawal from opioids or benzodiazepines just because they were prescribed those by a doctor. And they don't have a use disorder. They were just prescribed those by a doctor. So if you don't have a use disorder, you can absolutely have intoxication or withdrawal. And you just diagnose intoxication or withdrawal. If you are intoxicated in front of me and you have a use disorder, then look at the coding procedures. At the bottom of 549, you're not giving 2 diagnoses. You're giving 1. The clinician should use the code that applies to the class of substances, but record the name of the specific substance. So that's really important. You now can say heroin intoxication instead of opioid intoxication. That's important to remember, that you can do that. Instead of just saying inhalant use disorder, you can say glue or solvent. And then it says the very last word on the bottom of 549, note that the appropriate ICD-10 codes for substance intoxication and substance withdrawal depend on whether there's a comorbid substance use disorder. So the code will change if you have a use disorder also. So if someone comes in and they are in active opioid withdrawal right in front of me, this is my office, this is where they sit, that's why I'm doing that. Right in front of me, they're in active opioid withdrawal. And they tell me they have a history of being in and out of rehabs, like they absolutely have a use disorder. I'm going to code underneath withdrawal and show in my F code that there's also a use disorder. So that's only 1 diagnosis. It's all mushed together. Does that make sense to everybody? You don't have to memorize that. It's in the DSM, but it's something I want to point out to you. In my office, I do outpatient. Nobody comes in under the influence that I know of. Every now and then someone says they've smoked weed before they come in, and I'm kind of annoyed. Okay, Julie, I will absolutely repeat. But I don't usually ever use the diagnoses intoxication or withdrawal because people aren't in my office under the influence or withdrawing because I'm an outpatient. I just use disorders and move on. If somebody has intoxication, they're drunk in front of me and they have alcohol use disorder, it's only 1 code. And I look under the directions of substance intoxication on how to code intoxication and use disorder all together in 1 little bitty code. If someone in front of me is under the influence and now they're in withdrawal, and they also have a use disorder, it's only 1 itty bitty code. And I look under opiate withdrawal and it tells me how to code both in 1 F code. It's both in 1 F code. In the old days, you saw 2 diagnoses: comorbid substance opioid intoxication or opioid withdrawal, and opioid dependence. And there were 2. In the new days, it's 1 F code. under the umbrella of intoxication and use. Heather just asked, have you ever utilized a caffeine disorder diagnosis? Funny that you asked that, Heather, because if you noticed in the 5 TR, there is no caffeine use disorder. How funny is that? So if you look, there are a couple drugs, because remember what they did from the 4 TR to the 5 in the substance section. Instead of abuse and dependence, they gave you every tiny little tiny mini, every single drug has a mini section now, which is amazing. And if you go to caffeine, I find this very funny. If you go to caffeine, those of you that love your caffeine, and you look under 569, you'll see no use disorder. That's in the area of research. So theoretically, you cannot be addicted to caffeine anymore. You're all very welcome. Cheers. They're researching it because a use disorder connotates certain behaviors as symptoms, right? The 11 criteria, mild, moderate, severe. Under caffeine, there's no use disorder because they don't feel like the same behaviors occur when you have a ton of coffee. But they still kept caffeine intoxication, caffeine withdrawal, caffeine mental disorders, and unspecified caffeine-related disorders. I had a guy in my office yesterday, so it's really, really funny that you asked this. Have I ever utilized a caffeine diagnosis? Yesterday, I have a client that said, I've been sober 100 days, but my caffeine intake is super high now, and I'm getting heart palpitations. And he said, I know, Jennifer, you're going to tell me to see my doctor to rule out medical first, because, you know, I train my clients. I'm going to see my doctor, but could this be too much caffeine? And I said, yeah, if you look under caffeine intoxication, it says tachycardia or cardiac arrhythmia, but I'm not a doctor, so go make sure it's not something else. But yes, it very likely could be caffeine intoxication. So he's not really addicted to caffeine because we don't have a use disorder, but we call it cross addiction, where now he's overusing caffeine because he's not drinking. And so that's something to pay attention to. So the answer is yes, I have utilized caffeine diagnoses. So my recommendation as you deep dive into this section, remember that the old DSMs were abuse and dependence, and now 5 in the 5 TR is use disorder, mild, moderate, severe. You no longer have abuse and dependence, but this is what I'll train you on today. Moderate to severe connotates addict alcoholic, even though those are lay terms. Moderate to severe connotates addict alcoholic. You can be moderate and meet a certain number of criteria, and the ones you meet, maybe still the old abuse. Maybe still the old abuse. Or you can meet severe and it's like, okay, that's the old dependence. But between moderate and severe, you might treat people differently than if they're mild. If someone's mild use disorder, you might not consider them someone who needs to be in recovery. Someone who's moderate to severe, that's heading towards alcoholic addict. And so you got to individually assess each person on how close they are to those old terms. Patty said, I have people from probation come in for a substance use disorder, intoxicated for an OVWI and drove here. Yeah, isn't that great? That's great. So they drove there. Thank you. Most people in 12-step programs drink excessive amounts of coffees, yeah, or soda or sugar. So absolutely. So what I want to highlight is when we moved from the abuse and dependence and we moved to the use disorders, we have 11 criteria now. 10 of those criteria are old ones from the 4 TR and 1 is craving. So remember, someone asked about remission, and I'm going to go all the way back to the remission question because I don't want to miss anybody's question. Are there changes in the 5 TR to the in remission modifiers? So let's go to alcohol and let's look. I don't believe there are changes to the remission in early sustained. Yep, it's still early and sustained. There are no changes. So Jeffrey asked a little bit ago, are there changes in the 5 TR to the in remission modifiers? The 5 and the 5 TR both have early remission, 3 months criteria free, sustained remission, 12 months criteria free. The 4 TR said 6 months, but that's gone. So it's 3 and 12 for remissions. Remember that there's one criteria in the list of 11 that's an exception to the remission, and that's craving. You can crave your whole recovering life and still be in remission. So remember that criteria is an exception to the remission. So, and Jamaica, okay, great. We're answering all the questions. Perfect, perfect, perfect. So legal involvement was taken out of the 4 TR to the 5. So they don't say legal anymore, right? And then the 10 out of the 11 are old ones. And then the one new one is craving. So yeah, Michelle, they dumped legal from the 4 TR to the 5 and they added craving. So you're absolutely right. And then people will say, oh my gosh, they dumped legal. I don't get it. I don't get it. What happens if they've had 4 DUIs? Well, that'll be involved in the other criteria. Okay. I want to point something out if you've not ever noticed this, and it's important. So I want to point out two things before we hit time. One thing in the substance section on page 550, it says substance medication induced mental disorders. And it gives us lots of directions on what those are. And remember, you're not going to see those in this section. They're sprinkled through the DSM and all your other sections. So in the depression section, you'll see substance-induced depression, and then it'll give the list in the depression section of which substances create depression. So the other sections are going to tell you where the mental disorders are. But in this section, they're giving us a paragraph about it to say, hey, don't forget about them. So don't forget about them. I want you all to read the intro section in this new DSM. I would read the intro section on every single diagnosis that you diagnose. Don't read it like a novel, that'll overwhelm you. But every time you diagnose somebody, read the intro to that section, read the course and prevalence, and read the differential diagnosis. Just go back into the narrative. Even if you've been around for 30 years, reread it. That's where it will show you the new language. And when you're coding in this section, just go back to the DSM, even if you've memorized codes, and look at the codes. Is there a list somewhere by diagnosis which substances are associated with them? Is there a list somewhere by diagnosis on which substances are associated? So I don't know if there's one comprehensive list. But if you go into the depression section and you go under substance-induced depression, you'll see the list because that's how you code. Alcohol-induced depression is coded differently than alcohol-induced anxiety, which is coded differently than cannabis-induced depression and cannabis-induced anxiety. So the list of substances under each mental condition are in each of the sections. So the psychosis section, when you see substance-induced psychosis, it'll give you the list of drugs. In the depression section, when you see substance-induced depression, you'll give you the list of drugs. In the anxiety depression, where you see substance-induced, list of drugs. So that's where you're going to find all your lists. The other thing I want to point out before I open it up to any last questions, because I'm being mindful of the time, is in this section on substances, I want to point out that there are 2 sections with very, very, very special notes under diagnosing. And this changed from the 4 TR to the 5, but you might not have deep dived and read. So I want to point it out to you. It's in the opiates section. So write this down, opiates instead of hypnotics. It's in opiates and it's instead of hypnotics. So let's go to the opiate list just really quickly, and then I'm going to peek at your questions. When you look at the opiate list, which is on page 608, and you see opiate use disorder, and then you go to 609, I want to point out 2 things to pay attention to, and this is also in the sedative hypnotic section, which is also called a benzo. If you look under number 10, tolerance, and number 11, withdrawal, you'll see notes. This criterion is not considered to be met for those taking opioids or benzos solely under medical supervision. And then withdrawal, note, This criterion is not considered to be met for those individuals taking opioids or benzos solely under appropriate medical supervision. This was added to the 5 for folks that are physiologically dependent because they've been on pills for their chronic pain forever. But then someone took their pills away and now they have tolerance and withdrawal and everyone thinks they have a use disorder. Maybe they don't, maybe they do. So you have to consider, if I've been on pills for my chronic pain forever, you're not allowed to use the criteria tolerance and withdrawal to see if I have a use disorder. For example, my mom had 4 back surgeries. When they took her off opiates, she had tolerance and withdrawal, but she had no other criteria for a use disorder. So she didn't have a use disorder. She just had it because they put her on so many opiates. You have folks that have jumped the line to a use disorder. So you have to look at the other 9 criteria and see if they meet any of those, but you're not allowed to use 10 and 11 when you diagnose. So that is important to pay attention to in the opioids and the sedative hypnotics. Sedative hypnotics, it's for your anxiety clients that have been on benzos forever. Maybe they're not addicts. Maybe we need to remove tolerance and withdrawal, then look at the other 9, then to decide based on the other 9 if they have a use disorder. All right, questions. Does the DSM-5 TR describe the difference between substance-induced mental condition and mental health condition? A little bit, Nita. So it describes in a paragraph that I pointed out in the beginning of the intro section what they are. And then in every single section, it gives a little blurb on how this could be created by a drug. But I don't think it's doing what you're hoping and asking it's doing. But yes, in each section, it gives a description, but nobody puts them side by side, except for these couple paragraphs. So I would suggest, if you've never read the narrative in each section, under the induced disorders, read the narrative, and it's going to give you more of a description than just reading the criteria. Can you use tolerance and withdrawal to quantify severity? Nope. You have to remove tolerance and withdrawal from your brain and only diagnose them based on the 9. That's it. All right. Let me see other questions. Alyssa put up stuff to be mindful of as we finish. And let's see if there's any other questions. Sarah said, does that change take away the responsibility of the prescribing provider in introducing a substance to an individual who's predisposed? No, it does not take away the responsibility. In fact, it's highlighting it. Such a good question. So it's highlighting the responsibility. Anybody who gives anyone an extended experience with an opioid or an extended experience with a benzo is setting that person up for possible tolerance and withdrawal. If that person has red flags, like genetic predisposition for addiction, they have red flags for being addicted, we never should give them any of that. But sometimes that person doesn't know. So if you're working with someone and they're like, oh yeah, I had a million red flags to be addicted to this, it's very likely they also have a use disorder. Or if you have somebody who, my battery is running low, we don't want looks like my plug came out. Okay. Or if you have somebody who has been on opioids forever, but they don't have the propensity for addiction, they might just need tolerance and withdrawal help and then they're fine. So it's always about considering that. Really great question. I find it interesting that a diagnosis for tobacco is still in the DSM. When it's nicotine that's an issue, vaping is a huge issue. You absolutely can diagnose vaping nicotine under tobacco. Absolutely. If a doctor prescribes a benzo long-term, should not counseling be mandatory? If there's a benzo long-term for anxiety, that person should absolutely be in therapy, 100%. In fact, I would hope that someone would do therapy and try anything else before going on a benzo. I always say benzos are the last resort. I wouldn't put my worst enemy on a benzo because I feel like so benzos are known to be habit forming within 5 days of prescribed use. So I loathe benzos. Do they chase drugs when they don't have them? I'm not sure what that means, Carl. Are there discussions about including electronic addiction in the DSM? Yes. So in the back of the book, you'll see areas to research. is technology addiction. So this is, I'm going to give you all, since we have 5 minutes, my opinion about that. In the addiction section of the DSM, it gives us gambling and substance, because those are the two that are researched to be brain addictions, genetically predisposed brain issues. All the other things that we call addictions, like sex addiction, gaming addiction, food addiction, are more compulsive behavioral addictions that aren't quite researched under the umbrella of brain addictions. In my mind, I think gaming addiction, food addiction, sex addiction should be in the OCD section, because it's more of a compulsion. But all of the things that we call addiction in the lay world are being researched to be included in this section. Yes. Yep. Patty, I've said that for 30 years. Benzos are just alcohol in a pill form. Talking about some have substance use where others prescribe. Carl's talking about talking about some have substance where others prescribe, some do not. Oh gosh, Carl, I'm having so much trouble reading what you mean. I'm so sorry. I wish we could take you off mute. Yeah, so let me see. Do they have to chase? Yeah, but when some folks are not prescribed, they'll get them off the street. Is that what you're asking? I'm still not sure. I'm so sorry. In a controlled environment, are they truly in remission? That's a specifier. So that's why the controlled environment specifier is really, really important to add, because if someone's in remission in a controlled environment, that's going to be a different treatment implication than someone that's in remission out in the world. So really good question. Netflix documentary on Xanax is interesting and highly awesome. So folks are leaving. Okay, I'm going to try to finish Carl's question. Carl, type it one more time. All right, I see folks, we have 3 minutes left. It sounds like people are signing off. I feel really bad that I never understood your question, but I feel like I did my best. So thank you everybody for being here, and thanks for dealing with my really funky technology issues, because that's just how it is these days. So thanks everyone.
Thank you all. I will be sending out a follow-up email after this with the PowerPoint attached, and then with some more information regarding certificates and where to find the product once it's uploaded on our website. So thank you.
I'm going to put my email up as we're signing off. I totally cut Alyssa off. If you have any questions that I didn't get to, I feel super bad. So there's my email. So I hope 500 people don't email me. Go ahead, Alyssa.
No worries. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I can also add your email to the email that I send out at the end of this.
Perfect.
So thank you all
so
so much for being here. Have a great rest of your week.